You ever touch a wall and feel like something on the other side is touching you right back? That was the first thing Daniel asked me when he called my office. He didn't say the place was haunted. He didn't mention any murders or local legends. He just told me that a section of the second-floor hallway wall had turned soft like raw dough. Daniel bought the property in the summer of 1964. It was isolated deep in rural Pennsylvania, a massive, 5-story structure with narrow windows and too many rooms. The previous owner sold it for dirt cheap, desperate to jump on a plane to Germany for medical treatment. Daniel took the deal without asking questions. He moved in with his wife, 2 kids, and his elderly mother. The first 3 nights were dead silent. Then, at 2:14 a.m. on the 4th night, his wife woke him up. She wasn't screaming. She was just standing beside the bed, pointing a shaking finger at the bedroom door. Someone was standing in the hall, breathing heavily right outside the wood. Daniel grabbed a flashlight, yanked the door open, and found nothing. The next night, the kids swore they heard footsteps pacing directly above their room. The problem was, there was no 6th floor. Daniel checked the attic beams and found nothing but cobwebs. By the 3rd night, his mother refused to stay upstairs, claiming an old woman in a black dress was sitting on the edge of her bed. Daniel tried to convince himself everyone was simply exhausted. The house was old. The pipes made strange noises. Wood expanded and contracted at night. Every explanation sounded reasonable when he said it out loud. But none of those explanations explained why his mother refused to look toward the hallway after dark. Then came the physical evidence. At 3:06 a.m., 3 distinct knocks echoed from deep inside the plaster. Daniel took a hammer to the drywall and found nothing behind it except dry wooden studs. The next morning, his daughter found small, muddy footprints leading from the staircase straight to her bedside. The mud was fresh, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. Daniel wiped the floor clean, but by midnight, he heard his mother's voice calling his name from the basement. He walked down the stairs, only to realize his real mother was asleep upstairs. The voice in the dark whispered, "Don't come down here." Daniel froze halfway down the staircase. He could hear his own breathing. Then he heard another set of breathing below him. Slow. Heavy. Patient. He backed upstairs without making another sound, and when he reached the hallway, his mother was still asleep in her room. By the 5th night, his wife found thumbprints etched into the glass of the 3rd-floor window, pressed into the outside of the pane, 30 feet off the ground. Daniel called the former owner again. The man finally picked up, hesitated, and whispered, "You should have left that house alone." Daniel asked him what the hell was inside the house. The man didn't answer. He just hung up. Daniel called again. Straight to voicemail. At 1:40 a.m., furniture started dragging across the floorboards upstairs. Daniel climbed the steps, holding a wrench. The hallway was empty, but every single door was wide open. That was when he noticed the wall. The paint near the back room was bulging out. He pressed his palm against it. The plaster didn't crack, it gave way like wet clay. Daniel immediately pulled his hand back. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the wall moved. Just slightly. Like something behind it had shifted its weight. He pressed his palm against the surface again, slower this time, his fingers trembling as they sank into the soft plaster. Beneath the surface, his fingers traced the hard, unmistakable outline of a human face. He could feel the forehead. Then the cheek. Then the bridge of the nose. Daniel stopped breathing. The nose pressed outward against the latex paint, the mouth opened, and a voice inside the drywall whispered his name. Daniel stopped sleeping after that night. The family tried moving from room to room, looking for anywhere that felt safe, but the house was closing in. His wife heard heavy boots pacing the kitchen at midnight. His mother swore the old woman was standing at the end of the dining table every time the lights went out. Daniel started keeping every light on. He stopped walking through the hallway alone, even during the day. Every time the floor creaked behind him, his shoulders locked up before he could stop himself. He kept telling himself it was stress, exhaustion, an old house settling around them, but deep down he knew the sounds had started responding to them. His youngest daughter stopped talking entirely, except to ask one question: "Why is the lady in the black dress so mad at you?" Daniel asked her what she meant. His daughter pointed at the hallway and said, "She says you shouldn't have touched her face in the wall." Daniel felt his blood run cold. He hadn't told a soul about the face in the plaster. He spent the next morning tearing through old boxes in the attic until he found a framed photograph tucked behind an antique wardrobe. It showed a family from the 1930s standing on the front porch. At the edge of the frame, half hidden in the shadow of the doorway, stood the exact same woman, tall, pale, with a dark bruise wrapped around her neck like a scarf. Daniel stared at the photograph longer than he realized. Something about her eyes bothered him. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking toward the house, like she knew someone was watching the photograph decades later. When Daniel showed the photo to his mother, she dropped it on the floor. She remembered the local rumors from her childhood, a woman who had vanished from that property 30 years ago without a trace. That evening, Daniel heard his son laughing in his bedroom. He walked in and found the boy sound asleep, but the laughter was still coming from under the bed. Daniel lifted the mattress, empty space. Then his son sat up, eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "Dad, why are you crawling under my bed?" The boy wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking at the dark gap between the bed frame and the floor behind him. Daniel slowly turned. Nothing. But from somewhere underneath the floorboards came 3 soft knocks. The same 3 knocks from inside the wall. He grabbed his son and pulled him out of the room without taking his eyes off the darkness. The next morning, deep gouge marks were scraped into the hardwood floorboards, running from beneath the bed straight into the baseboards of the wall. Daniel called the previous owner one last time. The line crackled before the man answered in a raspy voice. Every family that stayed in that house left within a month, the man admitted. Or they just stopped coming out. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. What the hell does that mean? There was a long silence. Then the man whispered, "You already know." Before Daniel could demand answers, the line went dead. An hour later, his wife woke up screaming, her hands caked in dry plaster and dirt. She had been digging at the hallway wall in her sleep, her fingernails bloody, with no memory of doing it. Daniel stood over her, completely frozen, staring at the blood beneath her fingernails. Then he looked at the wall. There were fresh scratches across the plaster. 5 long marks. And beneath them, something had been written. Not with paint. Not with blood. With a fingertip pressed into the wet plaster. Daniel. Attached to the front door handle that morning was a small wooden box left on the porch. Inside was an iron key and a note written in jagged handwriting. "You were supposed to ask what's buried inside." The family packed 2 suitcases and drove to a motel 20 miles away. For the first time in weeks, they slept through the night, until 3 a.m., when Daniel woke up to find his daughter standing at the window, staring out into the dark parking lot. He watched her for several seconds before saying her name. She didn't move. He could see the faint reflection of her face in the glass, pale and completely expressionless. When he asked what she was looking at, she pointed toward the tree line. Miles away from where it was supposed to be, the dark silhouette of the 5-story house stood towering over the diner across the street. Daniel blinked, rubbing his eyes, and the structure vanished back into the night. His daughter turned to him and whispered, "It knows we left." Daniel felt the room suddenly become colder. He pulled the curtains shut and woke his wife. Nobody went back to sleep. They checked out before sunrise. Daniel called me from a payphone, his voice shaking as he offered double my normal rate to demolish the structure immediately. But before my crew could arrive, Daniel had to go back one last time to retrieve his family's legal documents from the home office. He stepped back through the front door alone. The interior was dead quiet, smelled faintly of stale perfume, and felt unnaturally freezing. He stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then, somewhere deep inside the house, a floorboard creaked. Daniel froze. He almost walked back outside. Instead, he forced himself forward. As he reached the second-floor landing, he heard his wife's voice calling from the third floor. He called back, but got no response. He walked up the wooden stairs. The third-floor hallway was pitch black. His wife was standing near the end of the hall, staring at a closed door. "Our daughter is inside," she whispered. Daniel knew his daughter was sitting in the car outside. He felt his stomach tighten. He looked toward the staircase. Then back at his wife. She didn't blink. Daniel rushed to the door, yanked it open, and revealed an empty, dusty bedroom. For a second, he couldn't understand what he was looking at. The room was completely untouched. No furniture. No footprints. Nothing. Then, from right behind him in the dark hallway, his daughter's voice whispered, "Daddy." Daniel's entire body went cold. He slowly turned his head. Before he could turn around completely, a second voice, identical to his daughter's, but metallic and hollow, echoed from the empty corners of the room in front of him. "Daddy." His wife shrieked as the bedroom door slammed shut by itself. Daniel grabbed her arm and sprinted down the stairs. He didn't look behind him. Neither did she. But halfway down, they heard footsteps following them. One step. Then another. Then another. Slow. Heavy. Coming down the stairs behind them. Daniel gripped his wife's arm harder and ran faster. Near the front entryway, red liquid was dripping from the clean white ceiling. It hit the floorboards with heavy, wet thuds. Daniel stopped. His wife almost crashed into him. He looked up. The ceiling plaster was dry, but pressed into the paint was the inverted shape of a human face, its jaw stretched wide, silently mimicking his wife's screams. Daniel stared at it for 1 second too long. The face slowly turned toward him. Not the whole ceiling. Just the impression. As if something buried above the plaster had moved its head. Daniel grabbed his wife and ran. They reached the front door, tore it open, and didn't look back. When Daniel called me the next morning, he didn't care about salvageable materials or property value. He didn't ask how much the demolition would cost. He just said, "Bring your heaviest equipment. There are things inside those walls that are still breathing." By the 5th day, Daniel's family stopped trying to pretend they could live a normal life. They stayed in the motel room, but the house followed them. At 2:30 a.m., the motel power cut out completely. Daniel woke instantly. For a few seconds, he couldn't hear anything except his own breathing. Then he noticed the bedroom door was open. He was certain he had locked it. Daniel slowly reached for his flashlight, trying not to wake the others. His fingers were shaking so badly he dropped it once before finally grabbing it. When he switched it on, the beam crossed the room. A figure was standing at the end of the bed. Tall. Impossibly thin. Motionless. Daniel couldn't see its face. He couldn't even tell if it was looking at him. He held the flashlight on it for several seconds, afraid that blinking would somehow make it closer. Then he blinked. The figure vanished. Daniel swung the light across the room. Nothing. His wife and children were still asleep. He almost convinced himself it had been another nightmare. Then his own voice echoed from the bathroom. "Daniel, come upstairs." His blood went cold. He knew that voice. It was his voice. But he hadn't spoken. He slowly turned toward the bathroom door. The darkness inside seemed deeper than the rest of the room. He didn't move. The voice came again, quieter this time. "Daniel, come upstairs." He woke everyone and told them to stay together. Driven by sheer exhaustion and panic, Daniel drove back to the property alone at dawn. He walked up to the 4th floor, a level he had kept locked since buying the place. The heavy wooden door at the top of the landing was hanging wide open off its hinges. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He stared at the opening. He couldn't remember ever unlocking that door. He climbed anyway. The 4th floor corridor was covered in decades of undisturbed dust, except for fresh, bare footprints dragging along the floorboards. Daniel followed them slowly. Every step made his chest tighten. The prints led to a single locked door at the end of the hall. He put his ear against the wood. Soft breathing. Then silence. Then his mother's voice pleading from the other side. "Daniel, unlock it. It's cold." Daniel closed his eyes. His mother was miles away. He knew that. He knew exactly where she was. But the voice sounded so real that for one terrible second, he almost reached for the lock. He pulled his hand back. He reached for his pocket knife, but before he could touch the lock, his wife's voice came from the door. Then his son's. Then his own. All three voices were speaking simultaneously from inside the dark room, chanting his name in unison. "Daniel. Daniel. Daniel." He stumbled backward. The door began to shake violently against its frame, as if something massive was throwing its weight against the wood. He wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. But his legs wouldn't move. Daniel stumbled backward down the hall. Standing near the stairwell was the old woman in the black dress. She hadn't been there a second ago. She raised a pale arm, pointing not at Daniel, but directly at the locked door. Her expression was completely empty. Daniel looked at the door. Then back at her. She slowly shook her head. Not a warning. Almost an instruction. "Don't open it." When the local police arrived an hour later on Daniel's emergency call, they forced the door open. The room was empty except for a single wooden chair in the center and a pile of small children's shoes stacked in the corner. There were dozens of shoes, dating back to different eras. Daniel stood behind the officers, staring at them. He couldn't explain why, but he recognized some of them. Inside the tongue of one leather shoe, the officer read a name stamped in ink. It belonged to Daniel's daughter. Daniel felt something inside his chest collapse. His daughter was alive. She was sitting in a motel room 20 miles away. She was supposed to be safe. Before the officer could draw his weapon, the wall beside them split open with a sickening crunch. A small, gray hand pushed through the lath and plaster, fingers flexing blindly in the open air. Nobody moved. For one horrible second, Daniel thought the hand was reaching for him. The officer fired 2 rounds into the wall. The shots exploded through the hallway. Silence followed. When they tore the drywall open, the cavity behind it was completely empty. No body. No bones. No hand. Nothing. Except for 4 words written in dark sludge on the interior framing. "We know you're here." Daniel told me he climbed to the 5th floor, the attic level, just hours before my crew arrived. He needed to see what was holding the roof up. The top level was a vast, Open room with exposed roof rafters and no windows. Hanging from the beams by thin copper wire were dozens of black and white photographs. Every person who had ever lived in or visited the house was pictured there. Daniel said he stood beneath them for several minutes, feeling like the entire room was watching him without making a sound. He couldn't explain why, but he suddenly became afraid to look directly at any of the photographs. Every time he glanced away, he felt certain one of them had changed. Near the back beam, Daniel found a fresh photograph of his own family taken from the driveway just yesterday. Standing right behind them in the reflection of the window was the pale woman in the black dress, flanked by a tall, featureless shadow. Daniel stared at the photograph, then slowly looked toward the attic window that wasn't there. For a moment, he swore he could hear his wife breathing somewhere behind him. He turned. Nothing. The attic was silent again. But Daniel could still hear breathing. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above him, between the rafters. He looked up. The photographs were hanging perfectly still. Another photo fell from the rafters, hitting the floorboards face up. It showed Daniel standing right where he was standing at that exact moment, staring up at the roof. But in the photo, his eyes were completely black, and his mouth was torn open at the edges. He didn't touch it. He didn't even bend down. He just stared at his own face in that photograph, trying to understand how someone could have taken it seconds before. Then he noticed something worse. The photograph showed the attic behind him. And in the picture, someone was standing directly over his shoulder. Daniel slowly looked at the floor beside him. There was nobody there. His breathing became shallow. He took one step away from the photograph. Then another. The photograph didn't move. But the figure inside it seemed closer. Daniel told me he wasn't sure if it was actually changing or if his exhausted mind was filling in the gaps. He didn't want to find out. He heard slow, heavy footsteps approaching behind him on the dry floorboards. One step. Then another. Then another. He spun around with his flashlight. Nothing. The beam traveled across the rafters, the photographs, the empty floor. Nothing moved. Then a cold raspy breath hit his ear from an inch away. Not yet. Daniel said his entire body locked up. He didn't know what those words meant. He didn't want to know. For several seconds, he couldn't even make himself breathe. Then one of the photographs behind him slowly began swinging from its copper wire. Back and forth. Back and forth. Daniel never turned around to see which photograph it was. He ran down the 5 flights of stairs, nearly falling twice, jumped into his truck, and drove straight to my office. He handed me the heavy iron keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them on my desk. His face was hollow, dark circles bruised under his eyes. He kept looking toward the office doorway while he talked, like he expected someone to walk through it. If you find bodies inside those walls when you tear it down, Daniel whispered, looking me dead in the eye, do not call the coroner. Just burn them. I asked him why. He leaned in closer and said, because I don't think all of them are dead. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Daniel looked down at his hands. There was a thin layer of gray dust covering his fingertips. I asked him where it came from. He stared at the dust like he had never seen it before. I don't know, he whispered. That was the last time I saw Daniel Mercer. The next morning, I loaded up my crew, grabbed my sledgehammers and heavy excavators, and drove out to the site. None of us knew what was waiting behind those walls. None of us knew how many people had disappeared inside that house. And none of us knew that Daniel's final warning wasn't really about what we might find. It was about what might find us. That was where Daniel's story ended, and mine began. Before I took the crew out, Daniel called my landline one final time at midnight. He sounded completely drained, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me what happened during his final attempt to sleep at the motel. At 5 a.m., his mother had vanished from her bed. The room door was still locked from the inside, her shoes were still beside the nightstand, and the window was bolted shut. Daniel searched the entire motel strip before his phone rang. It was his mother's voice on the line, sounding distant and muffled. "I'm back at the house, Daniel." The old lady opened the front door for me. Daniel said he didn't answer immediately. He just stood there holding the phone, staring at his mother's empty bed. Then the voice came through again. "Daniel?" He looked toward the motel door. For one horrible second, he thought he heard someone breathing on the other side. Then the breathing stopped. Daniel waited. Nothing. He slowly walked toward the door and pressed his ear against it. From the hallway came 3 soft knocks. Daniel didn't move. A few seconds later, his mother's voice whispered from the other side. "Let me in." He backed away from the door so fast he nearly fell. Daniel drove back to the property like a madman. When he stepped inside, the entire house was lit up. Every light bulb was blazing, the air smelled freshly painted, and the floorboards didn't creak under his weight. The silence was worse than the noises had ever been. Daniel said he could hear his own heartbeat. He walked into the dining room. His mother was sitting quietly at the dining table, staring straight ahead with a blank smile. When Daniel rushed to her side, he realized she wasn't breathing. Her skin was freezing cold, but her jaw moved slowly, whispering, "Don't let it see you." Daniel froze. He asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something behind him. Daniel slowly turned his head. Nothing. He looked back at his mother. She was still smiling. Then her eyes moved past him again. Daniel told me that was the moment he felt something inside the house become aware of him. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just the sudden certainty that something was standing somewhere nearby, listening to every breath he took. He didn't want to look behind him again. He looked up toward the ceiling. Heavy, dragging sounds were moving slowly across the floorboards of the second floor, then the third, then the fourth, all moving in rhythm toward the main staircase. Multiple sets of footsteps were coming down at the same time. Daniel grabbed his mother's hand. She whispered again, "Don't look at them." The footsteps stopped. Daniel stared at the staircase. Nothing appeared. Then one floorboard creaked. Another. Another. Something was coming down. Daniel could hear it getting closer, but he couldn't see anything. His mother's fingers suddenly tightened around his hand. Then she whispered, "They're looking for you." He didn't wait to see what it was. Daniel pulled his mother out of the chair, dragged her to the truck, and sped away into the morning fog. As he drove, he kept checking the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. But every few seconds, he could swear he saw a tall figure standing between the trees. Sometimes it looked closer. Sometimes it looked farther away. He never stopped. He didn't check into another hotel, he drove straight out of the state. He told me he didn't care what happened to the land anymore. He just wanted the structure erased from the earth. I took the keys, written directions, and a blueprint of the original foundation. I remember looking at that blueprint and noticing something strange. The house was supposed to have 5 floors. But beneath the foundation was another level. No basement was marked there. No staircase. No entrance. Just a rectangular space drawn underneath the entire structure. I asked Daniel about it. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "Don't go looking for that room." I asked him why. He didn't answer. I heard him breathing on the other end. Then, very quietly, he said, "Because something down there already knows you're coming." The line went silent. I thought I was dealing with a case of mass hysteria and an unstable old building. I was dead wrong. I've torn down abandoned factories, rotten barns, and fire-damaged tenements, but nothing prepared me for that house. The moment my crew stepped out of the trucks, the first thing that hit us was the smell. It wasn't sewage or wet rot. It was a sickeningly sweet scent, like rotten lilies mixed with copper. Nobody said anything at first. We just stood there looking at the house. The windows were dark, but I had the strangest feeling that someone was watching us from behind every single one. Marcus finally asked, "You guys feel that?" I knew exactly what he meant. The air felt heavy. Not cold, not hot, just wrong. Like the house was holding its breath. We started on the second floor. Two of my guys, Marcus and Miller, took heavy sledgehammers to the hallway wall where Daniel said he felt the soft plaster. On the third swing, Marcus's hammer didn't bounce off, it sank straight into the wall with a wet thud, like hitting a sack of wet sand. He froze. For a second, nobody moved. Then he slowly looked at me. "Boss." When he yanked the hammer back, a thick, dark fluid oozed out of the hole, dripping down to the baseboards. I grabbed a crowbar and peeled back a section of the lath. Tucked tight inside the wall cavity were old burlap sacks bound tightly with rusted wire. The smell coming from inside was worse now. Sweet. Metallic. Almost warm. I cut the wire on the top sack. A mummified arm tumbled out, the skin stretched tight over bone like dried leather. Marcus backed away, swearing under his breath, but before anyone could panic, the wall behind the cavity began to rise and fall. The entire structural partition was expanding and contracting in a steady rhythm, breathing like a dying lung. Nobody spoke. We could actually hear it. A slow, wet inhale. Then a long exhale. Again. And again. Miller dropped his tools and bolted for the front door. Before he reached the porch, the heavy oak front door slammed shut on its own, and the deadbolt turned with a loud click. Our heavy work lights began to flicker and hum. The sweet flower smell turned instantly into the stench of fresh iron and blood. Marcus shouted for Miller. No answer. We heard his footsteps pounding downstairs. Then silence. I called his name. Nothing. For some reason, I suddenly became terrified that if we made another sound, something would answer us. From directly above us on the third floor, 3 slow, heavy knocks vibrated through the floor beams. Tap. 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 Every man in that hallway looked up at the ceiling. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and told the crew to stay put while I checked the upper landing. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as I reached the top of the stairs. My breath became visible. The house was completely silent now. No wind. No pipes. No creaking wood. Nothing. I took one step forward. The floor creaked behind me. I turned around. Nobody was there. Another creak came from farther down the hallway. Then another. Like invisible footsteps were slowly following me. At the end of the third floor hall, a tiny leather shoe was sitting in the middle of the floorboards. I picked it up. Inside the lining, written in fresh black ink, was my own daughter's name. My fingers went numb. I dropped the shoe, and from the empty bedroom behind me, my daughter's voice sobbed. "Daddy, please come open the door." I stopped breathing. My daughter wasn't anywhere near that house. She was hundreds of miles away. I knew that. I had spoken to her that morning. I slowly turned toward the bedroom door. It was closed. The voice came again. Much quieter this time. Daddy? I took one step toward it before my brain finally caught up with me. I knew that voice. I knew the exact way she sounded when she was scared. That was what terrified me most. It wasn't some distorted imitation. It was perfect. I reached for the doorknob. Then someone grabbed my shoulder. I nearly screamed. It was Marcus. His face was white. "Don't," he whispered. I stared at him. "What?" He pointed at the door. "That's not your daughter." Before I could answer, something inside the room scratched slowly across the other side of the wood. Once. Twice. Then 3 long scratches. The voice stopped. The hallway went completely silent. Marcus leaned closer and whispered, "Boss, there's somebody standing behind that door." I looked at the gap beneath it. A shadow was visible on the other side. But it wasn't moving. Then the shadow slowly bent down. Like whatever was inside was lowering its face toward the floor. And a whisper came through the crack. "Open it." My hand moved away from the doorknob. The shadow disappeared. Then something knocked from inside the wall beside us. Tap. 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 And from somewhere deep inside the house, Miller finally screamed. My hand shook as I reached for the brass doorknob. I knew my daughter was at home with her mother 50 miles away, but the voice was so precise it made my stomach drop. I turned the knob and kicked the door open. The room was completely bare. The window was shattered, letting in the freezing wind, and the crying instantly stopped. For several seconds, I just stood there listening to the silence, waiting for that voice to come back. Nothing. But somehow, that silence felt worse. As I turned to walk out, I noticed the plaster beside the door frame was cracked wide open. Sticking out of the gray drywall were rows of small, hard white objects shining under my flashlight beam. I leaned in closer. They were human teeth, set firmly into the plaster like stones in concrete. I stared at them, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. My breathing became shallow. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice I just heard. It had sounded exactly like my daughter. Not close. Exactly. I ran my thumb along the edge of the wall. The teeth shifted slightly, sinking back into the soft drywall. Suddenly, the plaster clamped down on my index finger. Pain shot up my arm as the wall bit into my skin. I yanked my hand back, tearing the flesh, and watched as dark red blood dripped onto the floorboards. The plaster around the wound swelled up, absorbing the blood like a sponge. I stumbled backward. For 1 second, I thought I heard breathing inside the wall. Slow. Deep. Patient. Then something whispered my name from inside the plaster. I didn't answer. Downstairs, the crew started screaming. I ran down the stairwell 2 steps at a time. Marcus was on his back, kicking wildly at the floorboards near the front entry. A gray, dried-up hand had reached up through a crack in the hardwood and was gripping his ankle with crushing force. Marcus looked at me with pure terror. "Get it off me." I picked up a sledgehammer and brought it down hard on the fingers. They cracked like dry kindling, oozing a black, viscous tar instead of blood. The hand slipped back into the dark subfloor. Marcus scrambled away, breathing like he was choking. Then we all heard something moving beneath us. Not footsteps. Something crawling. It traveled from beneath Marcus to the hallway, then stopped directly under where I was standing. I couldn't move. Nobody could. The floorboard beneath my boot slowly lifted. Just a fraction. Then dropped back into place. We tried to break the lower windows to escape, but the glass was thick and hard as solid steel. Our hammers just bounced off the frames. Then the power cut completely, plunging us into total darkness. Someone whispered my name. I couldn't tell who. Then another voice whispered it from the opposite side of the room. Then another. Different voices. All saying the same thing. My name. I raised my flashlight, but my hand was shaking so badly the beam jumped across the walls. For a second, the beam caught Marcus's face. He was staring past me. His mouth was open. His eyes were locked on something standing directly behind my shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just slowly raised one trembling finger and pointed. I didn't turn around. I was too afraid of what I might see. From the dark entrance of the basement stairs, a familiar, calm voice called out to us. "Don't panic, boss. I came back to help you tear it down." It was Daniel's voice. Every man in the room went silent. I aimed my flashlight beam down the cellar steps. A figure was standing on the landing below. It looked like Daniel, but its arms hung down past its knees, swaying softly in the dark. I stared at its face. It was smiling. Not Daniel's smile. Something wearing his face. "Come on down," the thing rasped. "The Real Foundation is down here." Nobody moved. Then the figure tilted its head slightly. And from somewhere behind us, the front door slowly unlocked itself. Click. The thing at the bottom of the stairs smiled wider. "You don't have to stay trapped anymore, boss." I looked toward the door. Then back at the figure. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach turn. The thing downstairs wasn't trying to get us to come to it. It was trying to make sure we had somewhere to run. We backed away until our shoulders hit the locked front door. I kept the flashlight beam pinned on the thing at the top of the cellar stairs. Its face was a smooth, featureless slab of gray flesh, no eyes, no nose, just a wide slit for a mouth lined with rows of tiny, needle-sharp teeth. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The thing didn't move either. It just stood there, watching us without eyes, like it was waiting for someone to make the first mistake. Then its head tilted slightly. Marcus whispered my name. I raised one finger, telling him to stay quiet. The creature slowly leaned forward. Not walking. Just bending toward us, as if something invisible was pulling its entire body closer. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every beat seemed louder than the last, and for one insane second I wondered if the thing could hear it too. Then the mouth split open from ear to ear, and a blinding, unnatural blue light poured out of its throat, illuminating the entire hallway. Where the blue light touched the walls, the plaster melted like hot wax, exposing dark, writhing cavities inside the structure. The walls seemed to move around us. Not shaking. Breathing. Inside those cavities, I saw shapes. Hands. Faces. Something that looked like fingers pressed against the other side of the wall. Then one of the faces turned toward me. I recognized it. Daniel. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear him. I stepped backward. The creature's blue light followed me. I moved left. It followed. I moved right. The light followed again. It was watching me. Somehow, I knew it was watching me. The old woman in the black dress materialized at the far end of the corridor, a heavy coil of frayed rope wrapped around her neck. She raised a pale finger, pointing directly at my chest, and rasped. "You're late." My stomach dropped. I suddenly understood that she wasn't pointing at me because she wanted me dead. She was pointing at the wound on my hand. One of my workers collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest in terror. I grabbed him by the collar, hauled him up, and swung my heavy crowbar at the front door's iron lock with everything I had. The frame splintered on the third hit, and the heavy door burst open into the morning daylight. We fell out onto the grass, coughing and gasping for fresh air. The crew ran toward the work trucks, refusing to step anywhere near the porch. I sat on the hood of my truck, trying to stop my hands from shaking, when I looked down at my hand. The bite mark on my finger had turned a deep, bruised black. Thin blue veins were crawling up from the wound, spreading across my wrist toward my forearm. I stared at them. They weren't spreading randomly. They were moving in tiny branching lines, slowly climbing toward my elbow. I squeezed my wrist. The veins pulsed. Once. Twice. Like something underneath my skin had a heartbeat of its own. Then the pulse stopped. I held my breath. A second later, it pulsed again. Miller pointed at my face, his eyes wide with horror. "Boss, look at your eyes," he stuttered. I looked into the side mirror of the truck. Both of my irises had turned a bright, electric blue, the exact same color as the light from the creature's throat. I stepped away from the mirror. For 1 second, my reflection didn't move. I froze. Then it slowly smiled. I wasn't smiling. My stomach twisted so hard I nearly threw up. I realized then that the house wasn't just trying to kill us. It was infective. And whatever was inside that house wasn't finished with me. I jumped into the cabin of our heaviest excavator, turned the key, and slammed the steel bucket straight into the front porch. The house let out a low, grinding shriek that vibrated through the earth beneath our feet. Every window on the second floor shattered at once. And from somewhere deep beneath the ground, something answered with 3 slow knocks. Tap. 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 The outer walls collapsed under the excavator's weight, throwing up a massive cloud of gray dust and pulverized plaster. But as the dust settled, the upper floors didn't fall. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th levels remained hovering in mid-air, supported by nothing but dark, structural shadows. For several seconds, I just stood there staring at them. My brain kept trying to find a logical explanation. There wasn't one. Buildings don't stay standing when the foundation disappears. Not like that. The upper floors looked almost weightless, hanging against the gray morning sky while dust drifted beneath them. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The windows were moving. Not breaking. Moving. Every window on those floating floors slowly turned toward me, one after another, like 100 dark eyes following my position. My excavator operator scrambled out of the cab and fled down the dirt road on foot. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and walked toward the exposed foundation with my remaining crew member. He kept asking me if we should leave. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Some part of me already knew that leaving wasn't going to be that simple. Where the basement floor should have been, there was a massive, hand-dug shaft dropping deep into the earth. The walls of the shaft were lined with hundreds of human skulls, neatly stacked like bricks in a chimney wall. A crude stone staircase wound its way down into the abyss, and the sickening sweet floral smell was pouring out of the hole in heavy waves. The smell wrapped around my face and filled my lungs. For 1 second, I thought I could smell my own house. My own bedroom. My wife's perfume. Then I heard something breathing beneath us. Slow. Deep. Almost peaceful. My remaining crew member stepped backward. "Boss," he whispered. I looked at him. He was staring at the skulls. One of them had moved. I followed his eyes. A skull near the bottom of the wall was slowly turning toward us. I told myself it was settling. I told myself everything was settling. Then another one turned. Then another. Hundreds of empty sockets gradually faced the staircase. Facing us. From the bottom of the pit, my daughter's voice echoed up again. "Daddy, it's dark down here." My entire body went cold. She sounded scared. Not angry. Not possessed. Just scared. That somehow made it worse. Driven past the point of reason, I started down the stone steps alone, keeping one hand on the bone-lined wall. The temperature plummeted with every step until my breath came out in thick white clouds. Behind me, I heard my crew member whisper my name. I kept walking. He whispered it again. Then again. The voice changed on the fourth time. It was no longer his voice. It was mine. I stopped halfway down. I slowly looked over my shoulder. He was still standing at the top of the staircase. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at something behind me. His face went completely white. I turned back toward the darkness. Nothing. Just the stairs. Just the skulls. Just that terrible breathing beneath my feet. I kept going. At the bottom of the shaft was a cavernous room carved into the bedrock. In the center sat an antique wooden table. Lying flat on the table was the body of Daniel Mercer. He had been dead for days, his skin dry and mummified, his chest cut open. I stopped several feet away. Daniel's eyes were closed. Then his chest moved. Just once. A tiny rise beneath the dead skin. I stared at him. My mouth went dry. I waited. Nothing happened. I told myself it was air leaving the body. It had to be. Resting on his sternum was a small brass box. Inside were fresh Polaroid photographs, pictures of my own wife and children taken inside our living room just last night, and a final photo of me stepping down these exact stone stairs into the cavern. I picked up the final photograph. My hand started shaking. The picture showed me from behind. But I was standing farther down the staircase than I actually was. And something was standing behind me. A tall figure. Its hand rested gently on my shoulder. I looked up at the stairs. Nothing was there. Then I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. A voice spoke from the shadows behind me. "Welcome home, builder." I spun around with my flashlight. Standing in the dark corner was a man wearing my exact clothes, holding my tools, bearing my exact face. The replica of me stepped into the light, moving with my exact posture, mimicking my breathing. I watched its chest rise and fall at the same rhythm as mine, like my body had somehow been copied and placed in front of me. "Daniel thought he could escape by bringing you here," my double said in my voice. "But the house always needs a contractor to keep the walls standing." For a few seconds, I couldn't move. It was looking at me with my own eyes. Even the tiny twitch in its jaw was something I recognized. Something I had done 1,000 times. I raised the crowbar tighter in my hand. "I'm burying this place," I spat, raising my iron crowbar. "I'm turning every brick in this godforsaken hole to dust." My double smiled. Not immediately. Slowly. Like it had been waiting for me to say those exact words. The smile made my stomach twist because I knew that expression. It was mine. The same crooked little smile I made whenever I was trying to hide fear. My double smiled, exposing rows of small needle teeth. "The house isn't just wood and stone anymore," it whispered. "Look at your arm." I looked down. The blue lines had crawled up my neck, burning like liquid fire beneath my skin. I could feel them moving. Not spreading. Moving. Something was traveling beneath my skin toward my jaw. I swallowed hard. For one insane second, I wondered if it could reach my brain. Then I noticed my double staring at my throat. Not my eyes. Not the wound. My throat. Its smile disappeared. That scared me more than the teeth. I lunged forward and drove the heavy iron crowbar straight into the creature's face. The impact echoed through the cavern. It didn't bleed. A thick, black sap poured from the wound as the thing caught the iron bar with its bare hand, bending the solid steel like wet cardboard. I froze. It slowly pulled the bent crowbar from its face. Then it looked at me. And smiled again. The pale woman and dozens of shadow figures emerged from the stone walls, surrounding the table, their empty eyes fixed on me. I backed away. There were too many. They weren't attacking. That was what terrified me. They were just watching. Every single one of them stood perfectly still, waiting. Like spectators. Like they already knew how this ended. One of the shadow figures leaned toward another and whispered something I couldn't understand. Then the second figure looked at me. They both smiled. I reached into my tool belt, pulled out a flare, struck it against the stone wall, and shoved it straight into the open wooden chest of Daniel's corpse. The dry bone and aged wood caught instantly, bursting into a roaring blue flame that spread across the table and onto the stone floor. For a moment, the entire cavern became painfully bright. And in that blue light, I saw something carved into the wall behind Daniel. Hundreds of names. Some were old. Some were faded. Some looked freshly scratched into the stone. At the very bottom was my name. I stared at it. The letters were still wet. Then one of the shadows pointed at my name. Slowly. Like it wanted me to understand. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered the glass in my flashlight. I turned and scrambled up the stone stairs as the blue fire licked at my boots. Behind me, something started climbing. Fast. The stone steps shook beneath my feet. I didn't look back. I heard my own voice screaming from somewhere below. "Run, boss." Then another version of my voice answered from farther down. "Don't run." Then another. "You're already home." I reached the surface, jumped back into the heavy excavator, and slammed the steel bucket into the main support beams with pure rage. The skull-lined shaft caved in, bringing the hovering upper floors crashing down into the earth in a deafening roar of splintering timber and shattering stone. The ground shook beneath the excavator. Dust swallowed everything. I kept driving the bucket down. Again. And again. And again. We dumped tons of dirt over the hole until the ground was completely flat. The house was gone. I sat inside the excavator, breathing hard, staring at the empty patch of earth. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was nothing there. No house. No voices. No footsteps. No shadows. Just dirt. I almost believed it was over. Then something knocked once beneath the ground. I stopped breathing. Another knock came from directly beneath the excavator. Then a third. I stared at the dirt. My hands tightened around the controls. Then I noticed something on the excavator's windshield. A single fresh handprint. From the inside. The police investigation ruled the site a structural hazard built over an illegal 19th century burial pit. The remains were hauled away, the land was condemned, and I went back home to my family in the city. I tried to put it behind me. The bite mark on my finger healed into a dark, jagged scar, and the blue veins on my arm faded back beneath my skin. My eyes returned to their normal color, and for 6 months, life went back to normal. My business thrived, my daughter played in the yard, and the sweet smell of rotten flowers finally left my nose. For 6 months, I convinced myself I had imagined parts of it. Not all of it. Just enough to sleep. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and stare at the bedroom door, waiting for footsteps that never came. Sometimes I'd catch myself checking the walls. I'd press my palm against the plaster. Cold. Solid. Normal. Every time, I felt stupid afterward. Then winter came. Last night, a heavy snowstorm knocked out the power lines across our neighborhood. My wife and daughter were fast asleep upstairs. I was sitting in the dark living room by the fireplace, reading by candlelight. The house was completely silent. Too silent. I could hear the fire popping, the clock ticking, my own breathing. Then the clock stopped. The second hand froze. I looked at it. 3:06 a.m. At exactly 3:06 a.m., 3 soft, distinct knocks echoed from inside the dry plaster of our living room wall. Tap. 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 The candle flame bent toward the wall. I stood up, the candle shaking in my grip, and walked slowly toward the wall. Every step felt wrong. The floorboards seemed louder than they should have been. I kept expecting someone to whisper my name. Nobody did. I pressed my palm against the smooth, freshly painted drywall. The wall was soft. It gave way under my hand like wet dough. I pulled my hand back immediately. My fingers were trembling. For a few seconds, I just stared at the wall, trying to convince myself that exhaustion, darkness, and memory were playing tricks on me. Then something pressed against the other side. Slowly. Deliberately. The shape of a palm formed beneath the paint. My breath stopped. Beneath the paint, I felt the hard, cold outline of a face pressing back against my palm, its mouth moving silently beneath the latex layer. I couldn't move. The face seemed to follow my hand. When I shifted my palm left, it shifted with me. When I pulled away, the outline remained. Then the mouth opened wider. No sound came out. But I knew exactly what it was trying to say. I backed away from the wall. The candle flame suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the room. I heard a faint scraping sound inside the plaster. Something was moving. Not behind the wall. Through it. I could hear fingernails dragging slowly across the inside surface, searching for a weak spot. I whispered my wife's name. No answer. Then I heard my daughter's bedroom door open upstairs. My stomach dropped. I looked toward the staircase. Small footsteps began descending. 1, 2, 3. Slow and sleepy. I wanted to run upstairs. I couldn't. From the top of the stairs, my daughter walked down in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes in the dark. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing at the wall behind me. I turned toward her. Her face looked completely normal. Too normal. Then she smiled. Not her usual smile. A tiny, tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. The wall behind me made another sound. 3 soft knocks. My daughter stared at it. "The lady in the black dress says our new house is almost finished." I felt every muscle in my body lock. I looked at the wall again. The face beneath the paint was gone. For 1 second, I thought maybe it was over. Then my daughter whispered something else. I couldn't hear her. I stepped closer. "What did you say?" She pointed at the wall again. "She says you're the builder." My scar began burning. I looked down at my hand. The dark jagged mark had opened. A thin line of black blood slowly appeared across it. Then something inside the wall whispered in my own voice. "Welcome home, boss." And from upstairs, my wife's voice screamed my name. I looked toward the staircase. My daughter grabbed my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Don't go upstairs, Daddy." I stared at her. "Why?" She looked toward the wall. "Because she's already up there." The house went completely silent. Then, from the ceiling above us, I heard something heavy dragging itself slowly across the floor. One room. Then another. Then directly above my head. And 3 soft knocks answered from inside the wall beside me. Tap. Tap. Tap.